2019, a Hollywood archive, dusty file boxes marked classified. A researcher's hands tremble as they pull out yellowed FBI documents stamped with red ink. Monroe, Marilyn. Subject professional threats. Status monitored. Inside, three names appear again and again in agent reports from 1952 to 1962. Betty Grable, Joan Crawford, Shelley Winters. Not gangsters, not politicians, not even the Kennedy brothers. The FBI had been tracking something the world never knew about. Hollywood's most powerful women were waging a silent war against Marilyn Monroe. While newspapers screamed about presidential affairs and broken marriages, the real destruction was happening in studio corridors, dressing rooms, and party corners where cameras never reached. The documents reveal phone calls intercepted, complaints documented, sabotage attempts recorded. Every smile in those glossy photographs hid daggers. Every red carpet appearance masked territorial battles, and Marilyn Monroe fought this war alone until it killed her. Because in 1950s Hollywood, men held the power, but women could destroy you. This is the story the FBI buried, the war Hollywood never wanted you to see, and the three women who turned Marilyn's dream into a nightmare. Before we go deeper into this untold story, subscribe to our channel, because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about Marilyn Monroe and Hollywood's golden age. 1950, 20th Century Fox Executive Office. Darryl Zanuck sits behind mahogany. Across from him, Betty Grable, the studio's highest-paid star for 8 consecutive years, listens to words that will haunt her forever. Betty, you're a legend, but we're building someone new, younger. Marilyn Monroe. Grable's smile freezes. She knows what building someone new means in Hollywood. It means replacement. It means extinction. For a decade, Betty Grable had been Fox's golden goose. Her legs were insured for $1 million. Her films made fortunes. Soldiers carried her pin-up photos into World War II battles. She was American royalty. But now, in a windowless office, she was being told her kingdom was ending. Not because she failed, because someone younger existed, and that someone was Marilyn Monroe. The cruelty wasn't immediate. Fox was strategic. They cast both women together in How to Marry a Millionaire in 1953. Marketing it as two blonde bombshells, but behind the scenes, the sabotage was surgical. Studio photographers were instructed to give Marilyn better lighting. Wardrobe designed Marilyn's costumes to be more revealing, more memorable. And the cruelest cut, Marilyn's salary was lower, making her more profitable. Grable watched all of this happen. On set, she maintained professionalism, even kindness. One crew member recalled, Betty treated Marilyn with respect during filming, but the moment cameras stopped, Betty's face would go blank, like a light switching off. Because Betty Grable understood something Marilyn didn't yet. Hollywood only had room for one blonde queen at a time. The breaking point came at the film's premiere in November 1953. Betty stood on the red carpet watching photographers ignore her, rushing past her to capture Marilyn. A journalist actually pushed Betty aside to get closer to Monroe. That night in her dressing room, Betty Grable cried for the first time in her professional career. Her makeup artist later testified to FBI agents interviewing Hollywood insiders about Monroe's professional conflicts. The artist remembered Betty saying, "They created her to replace me, and I helped them do it by being in that film." The pain in her voice wasn't just about losing stardom. It was about being used as a stepping stone for her own replacement. But here's what the FBI documents reveal that nobody knew. Betty Grable began making phone calls to studio executives, to producers, to directors. The calls were coded, careful, but the message was clear. Marilyn Monroe was unreliable, unprofessional, difficult. Grable never attacked Marilyn publicly. She was too smart for that. Instead, she planted seeds of doubt in the minds of men who controlled Hollywood. One intercepted call from March 1954 captured Grable telling a Fox executive, "Marilyn's lovely, but can she carry a film alone without breaking down? You're gambling everything on a girl who might not show up." The executive listened, and slowly the whispers spread. Marilyn never knew who started the difficult actress reputation that would plague her entire career. She thought it came from directors tired of her lateness, from studios frustrated with her method acting demands. but FBI surveillance suggests Betty Grable was the original source. Not out of pure malice, out of survival. Because in Hollywood's brutal hierarchy, if you weren't destroying your replacement was destroying you, and Betty Grable chose to fight. The war was silent, invisible, conducted through whispers and phone calls, but it was devastatingly effective. By 1954, Marilyn Monroe was a star, but she was also marked as problematic, and that mark would follow her forever. 1955, an MGM garden party in Beverly Hills. Hollywood royalty mingles under string lights. Joan Crawford stands at the center, martini in hand, surrounded by the old guard, Bette Davis, Barbara Stanwyck, Rosalind Russell. These were women who built Hollywood through discipline, control, and ruthless professionalism. Then Marilyn Monroe arrives, white dress, red lips that walk. Joan Crawford doesn't even look. A production assistant working the party later told FBI agents Crawford saw Marilyn coming. She literally turned 45 degrees and continued her conversation as if Marilyn didn't exist. It was the coldest power move in Hollywood history. Joan Crawford's hatred for Marilyn Monroe wasn't about jealousy, it was about contempt. Crawford had clawed her way from poverty to stardom through iron discipline. She arrived on set at dawn, knew every line perfectly, hit every mark precisely. Her control was legendary. Her professionalism was armor. Marilyn Monroe represented everything Crawford despised: vulnerability as a tool, lateness as acceptable, emotion as performance. To Crawford, Marilyn was a child playing dress-up in a profession that demanded warriors, and Crawford made sure everyone knew her opinion. The campaign was subtle but vicious. Crawford would attend industry dinners, and when Marilyn's name came up, would pause, smile, and say, "Such a dear girl, so talented." If only she took the craft seriously. The words sounded supportive. The tone dripped poison. Everyone in Hollywood understood the code. Crawford was signaling that Marilyn wasn't a real actress, wasn't a professional, wasn't worthy of respect. And when Joan Crawford spoke, Hollywood listened. Directors began seeing Marilyn differently. Not as a method actress pursuing depth, but as an amateur faking intelligence. Crawford's whispers became industry gospel. But the cruelest moment came in 1956, when Marilyn was studying at the Actors Studio in New York. She was desperately trying to be taken seriously, working with Lee Strasberg, attempting to shed the dumb blonde image. A journalist asked Joan Crawford about Marilyn's artistic ambitions. Crawford's response, printed in multiple newspapers: "I have no comment on Marilyn Monroe, except to say that professionalism is something you're born with or you're not, and no acting class can teach you to show up on time." The quote was a dagger wrapped in silk. It suggested Marilyn's entire artistic journey was a joke, that her struggles were character flaws, not legitimate challenges. Marilyn read that quote in her New York apartment. Her acting coach remembered finding her crying, the newspaper crumpled in her hands. "Why does she hate me? I never did anything to her," Marilyn whispered. But that was the point. Marilyn didn't have to do anything. Her existence threatened the old order. Her vulnerability made Crawford's armor look cold. Her struggles made Crawford's perfection look inhuman. Joan Crawford saw Marilyn Monroe as a virus infecting Hollywood's professional standards, and Crawford dedicated herself to making sure Marilyn never received the respect she craved. Marilyn had given a critically acclaimed performance in The Prince and the Showgirl, and rumors suggested a nomination was possible. Crawford's message to voters was simple: rewarding instability sends the wrong message to young actresses. The campaign worked. Marilyn wasn't nominated, and Joan Crawford's silent war claimed another victory. Because Crawford understood that in Hollywood, destroying someone's reputation was more effective than any public confrontation. You didn't need to fight Marilyn Monroe. You just needed to make sure nobody took her seriously. 1946, a cramped Los Angeles apartment. Two young actresses share rent dreams and secrets. Marilyn Monroe and Shelley Winters, both unknown, both hungry, both believing they'll conquer Hollywood together. They rehearse scenes in their underwear because they can't afford costumes. They share a single lipstick because they can't afford two. They promise each other when we make it, we'll never forget where we came from. They promise each other we'll always protect each other. But Hollywood doesn't allow promises like that to survive. The fracture began slowly, invisibly, like ice cracking under weight. Shelley got her first big break in 1947, then another. By 1951, she was a respected character actress, building a solid career. Marilyn's rise was different. Meteorically fast, impossibly bright. In 1953, Marilyn became a superstar. Shelley was still working steadily, but she was now in Marilyn's shadow, and in Hollywood, shadows are suffocating. Friends who worked with both women noticed the change. Shelley's jokes about Marilyn became sharper. Her compliments became backhanded. "Marilyn's so talented, for someone who never trained properly," she'd say at parties. The words sounded like support. The subtext was poison. By 1956, their friendship had become a performance for photographers. They'd smile together at premieres, hug for cameras, but crew members noticed they rarely spoke off camera anymore. An FBI informant working as a studio assistant reported overhearing Shelley on the phone in 1957. "Marilyn's lovely, but she's her own worst enemy. The pills, the lateness, the neediness. I love her, but I can't be dragged down with her." The words were said with concern, but they were repeated by the person she was talking to, and repeated again, until they became part of Marilyn's reputation. The final betrayal came in 1960. Marilyn was falling apart. Let's Make Love was a disaster. Her marriage to Arthur Miller was crumbling. She called Shelley at midnight, desperate, begging for help. The FBI had tapped Marilyn's phone as part of their Kennedy investigation, and the transcript survives. "Marilyn, Shelley, I can't do this anymore. Everyone hates me. I need you to tell me I'm not crazy." There's a long pause on the recording, then Shelley's voice, careful, distant. "Marilyn, I love you, but I can't fix you. You need professional help, real help, not friends who enable you." The call ends. Marilyn is crying. What Marilyn didn't know, Shelley had already started talking to publishers about a tell-all memoir. FBI documents suggest Winters was gathering stories about Marilyn's vulnerabilities, her breakdowns, her dependencies, not to help her, to profit from her pain. The memoir wouldn't be published until after Marilyn's death, but Shelley was collecting material even while pretending to be a friend. One agent's note from 1961 reads, "Winters is documenting Monroe's decline, likely for future book deal, maintaining friendship facade while gathering ammunition." The cruelest irony, Marilyn still considered Shelley a friend until the end. In her final months, she'd mentioned Shelley in interviews as one of the few people who knew me before I was Marilyn. She had no idea Shelley had already mentally written her obituary. Because Shelley Winters understood something about Hollywood's survival. Loyalty to struggling friends was a luxury successful people couldn't afford. You either climbed over them or you went down with them. And Shelley chose to climb. Here's what the FBI files reveal that connects all three women. They never met to discuss Marilyn, they never coordinated attacks, but they didn't need to, because Hollywood's power structure created a natural alliance among established women against rising threats. Betty Grable whispered to executives, Joan Crawford whispered to the press, Shelley Winters whispered to publishers, each acting independently, but the effect was a coordinated destruction campaign. Marilyn felt it, but couldn't name it. In therapy sessions recorded by her psychiatrist and later subpoenaed by investigators, Marilyn repeatedly mentioned feeling attacked by other women, but couldn't explain why. She'd say, "The men are obvious, they want to sleep with me or control me, but the women, they smile and destroy me at the same time, and I don't know why." Her therapist suggested paranoia, but the FBI documents prove she was right. The conspiracy wasn't about hatred, it was about survival. Hollywood had limited space for women over 30, even less for women over 40. Grable was fighting to extend her career. Crawford was protecting her legacy. Winters was building her post-acting literary career. And all three saw Marilyn Monroe as either a threat or an opportunity. None saw her as a human being worth protecting. By 1962, Marilyn Monroe was the most famous woman in the world and the loneliest. The FBI surveillance from her final year makes devastating reading. She's on the phone constantly, calling people who don't call back. She's attending parties where people smile at her and talk about her the moment she leaves. She's taking more pills because the isolation is unbearable, and through it all she keeps asking the same question, why do women hate me? The answer was simple but unbearable. They didn't hate her, they feared her, they envied her, they needed her to fail so they could succeed. But none of them saw her as a sister worth saving, and in Hollywood's brutal mathematics, that amounted to the same thing as hatred. August 4th, 1962, Marilyn's final night. The FBI report notes she made 17 phone calls that evening, 15 went unanswered. One was to her psychiatrist, who came to her house. One was to Peter Lawford, who heard her slurring and didn't go to check on her. None were to Betty Grable, Joan Crawford, or Shelley Winters, because by then, Marilyn had learned the lesson Hollywood taught her. The women she thought might understand her were the ones who understood how to profit from her destruction. Betty Grable retired from film in 1955, the same year Marilyn's stardom peaked. She spent her remaining years performing in Las Vegas, never speaking publicly about Marilyn, but those who knew her said she kept newspaper clippings of Marilyn's struggles, not with satisfaction, with something closer to recognition, because Grable understood she'd been replaced exactly the way she'd feared, and no amount of sabotage had stopped it. Joan Crawford never softened. When Marilyn died, a reporter asked Crawford for a comment. Her response, "It's a tragedy when anyone dies young, but it's not surprising when someone refuses to take their profession seriously." Even in death, Crawford couldn't grant Marilyn dignity, because to Crawford, Marilyn represented the death of old Hollywood's values, and Crawford would rather die than admit those values had failed. Shelley Winters published her memoir in 1980. It was full of stories about young Marilyn, painting herself as the loyal friend who tried to save a troubled soul. The book never mentioned the midnight call where she abandoned Marilyn, never mentioned the years of subtle sabotage, never mentioned that she'd been documenting Marilyn's pain for profit, even while pretending to care. The memoir became a bestseller. Shelley made hundreds of thousands of dollars from Marilyn's memory. The surveillance files were never meant to be public. The FBI was investigating Marilyn because of her Kennedy connections, but in the process, they documented something more insidious, the systematic professional destruction of a woman by other women. The files contain intercepted calls, party surveillance, industry informant reports, all painting the same picture. Hollywood's most powerful women saw Marilyn Monroe as a threat and worked independently to neutralize her. Why did the FBI bury this? Because it complicated their narrative. They wanted Marilyn's story to be about presidential scandals, communist sympathies, dangerous liaisons. A story about women destroying women for professional survival was too complicated, too uncomfortable. It suggested Hollywood's real power dynamics weren't about male studio heads and casting couches. They were about women enforcing a hierarchy more brutal than any man's. Marilyn Monroe didn't die because of men. Not Kennedy, not DiMaggio, not Miller. She died because Hollywood created a system where women could only survive by destroying each other. Betty Grable had to attack her to protect her throne. Joan Crawford had to diminish her to preserve old values. Shelley Winters had to abandon her to build her own future. None of them were monsters. All of them were products of a system that gave women so little power they had to steal it from each other. The saddest part, Marilyn understood this. In one of her final interviews, she said, "I wish women would support each other more, but I understand why they don't. Hollywood only lets one of us shine at a time, and when your light is fading, you'll do anything to keep it burning, even if it means blowing out someone else's candle." She said this with compassion, not anger, because even while being destroyed, Marilyn Monroe tried to understand her destroyers. That's why her story matters. Not because she was a victim, but because she was a woman fighting a war nobody acknowledged existed. While the world watched her romance presidents and baseball players, the real battle was happening in dressing rooms and phone calls and whispered campaigns, and she fought that battle alone until it killed her. The FBI files prove what Marilyn always knew. Hollywood's cruelest war wasn't fought with fists or scandals. It was fought with smiles and whispers and the calculated withdrawal of support from one woman by other women. And in that war, there were no winners, only survivors and casualties. Marilyn Monroe was a casualty, but her story survives as evidence of a war Hollywood still doesn't want to acknowledge. The war women wage against each other when the system gives them no choice. The war that killed the most famous woman in the world while everyone watched and blamed the wrong enemies, that's the war the FBI documented and buried. That's the war we're finally uncovering. That's the truth about Marilyn Monroe that Hollywood never wanted you to know.